Hello, this is Dwight Mtonono, also known as Mnyaradzi, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. We're coming to the end of the year. I'm back in Zimbabwe. We are doing the second part of this series where we are looking at Christmas and should Christians, how we as Christians should approach this whole Christmas season. In the first session, we talked a little bit about the controversy around Christmas, the modern controversy around Christmas and paganism, and whether Christianity, whether we as Christians should be celebrating this. So I began to talk about some of that and how it is, especially in those first few years, how it is that Christianity replaced the pagan worship or the Roman worship of Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. And some of the things that happened in that early year, in those early years, where the Mithras and Sol Invictus were incorporated together. Mithras was in the eastern part of the empire, and the Romans already had Sol as their worship. And in order to try to bring the whole empire together, they combined the worship of Mithras and Sol Invictus and came up with this worship. But then when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, it took over from the Sol Invictus religion. And what the Christians then did was they took over the day. That really is what happened there. So Christianity before and after Constantine is what I want to talk about in this session. So from New Testament times to the Hellenistic period is what we deal with now. The Hellenistic period that I'm talking about is, AD, let's say 100 through to about AD 400, where we have the Greek influence on Christian culture. More and more, we find the strong Greek influence on Christian culture that happened. So New Testament Christianity was dominated by three categories of believer, but also had a few in the fourth category. So there were three dominant categories, but then a few were beginning to come in who were in the fourth category. So let me explain these three categories. The first category of Christian in the early church, or in those first 100 years, was a person who had been a Jew and who was part of Judaism. So people were coming out of Judaism into Christianity. So that is category number one of people who were Christians in that first century. Then the second category were people who had been proselyte. These are Gentiles who accepted the Jewish faith and then who also became Christians. So that was the second category of people that we see in the New Testament period. And then there's a third category of believers, people who were God-fearers. They were Gentiles on the way to become proselytes, or who remained uncircumcised for whatever reason, but worshipped the Jewish God and attended synagogue in the Gentile court. So those were people who were close to Judaism. These three categories were people who were close to Judaism. And when people like Paul would go into Gentile territory, they would generally go to the synagogue and look for this kind of person as the initial connection point, if you want, into that community. And then the fourth category, which you see beginning in the New Testament, but becomes more and more dominant after the New Testament time, is people who were totally pagan and had never heard of or had limited contact with the Jewish God. And who Paul would explain, when he would interact with them, he would explain God as the creator, to be the creator of all things. God, the creator. That would be the connection point that Paul would use in that instance. So before Constantine, for the early church, I'm quoting from from a book called The God That the Poor Seek. And he talks quite a bit about this point. He's talking about conversion, but there's some good points that he brings out in here. And he says, for the early church, conversion was not a moment or event, but a journey, a pilgrimage, an extended period of intentional formation. So there were 4 stages that begin to happen in that period immediately after, the first century going to the Roman period. There were 4 stages, which were evangelism. That is the contact with the potential believer. It was informal or was dependent on each person's experience. Somebody would tell you about Christ one way or the other, and you get to know about Christ. That is number 1 contact. And then the contact culminated in those who were attracted to Christianity, approaching the church leaders and requesting instruction. So maybe there'll be somebody who interacts with you as a Christian who's got no idea what a Christianity is. But as they see your life and as you testify, they begin to become interested in this thing called Christianity. And they're brought in to the leaders of the church and they begin to get instruction. They ask for instruction. And if they're approved, if the leaders do feel like this is a genuine person who is genuinely seeking God, this person was allowed to move to the stage 2, which was called a catechumen. Catechism is what you might have heard of in some of our traditional churches. But this started off in around the year 200, 180, 200. The catechumens were people who had interest in Christianity and wanted to get more instruction in it. And once they've been instructed and taught about what Christianity is, and they understand what it is, and there's significant change that can be seen in the life of the person, that they are now living a Christian life, the candidates move to stage 3, where they will get in line with the enlightenment, and where the teaching focused on belief. And besides teaching, they would be exorcised. If there's demonic issues, they would be cast out. Spiritual preparation culminating in baptism. So in stage 3, there would be a public demonstration, a public baptism. And then after that, maybe another stage of 4 where, more instruction of what Christianity was about would be given. So that's how Christianity happened in those first, especially after the New Testament period, going from about the year 100, going on to about 300 or so, 312, which is when Constantine comes into the picture. That is how Christianity worked. And that is how people became Christians in that period, which is what we call the Hellenistic period. But then now we see a shift in Constantine's time. And though Constantine had a life-transforming experience, he remained unbaptized and uncatechized, yet was considered a Christian. What happened with Constantine? Constantine saw, or he said he had a vision. And he had a vision of the cross. And he says, through this vision, he heard a voice that said to him, by this sign, conquer. This was the time when they were fighting. He was fighting another Roman general to have control of the Roman Empire. And he saw a cross. And he heard a voice that said, by this sign, conquer. And that was the beginning of Constantine's Christianity. He did not go through this process of becoming a catechumen or anything like that. He said, by this sign, conquer, and he became a Christian, quote unquote, by that. So the conversion of Constantine is significant because for the first time, a person was somehow a Christian in name only, without having undergone any test of their behavior, beliefs, or faith, and not becoming part of a Christian community or participating in any form of worship. So that is the entrance of a person into Christianity that we have there. And a persecution had ended in about 258, the year 258. Church membership grew rapidly, and Christians were no longer a minority, but a recognized part of the society by the time of Constantine. And by the end of the 4th century, by the end of the 300s, the emperors succeeding Constantine offered powerful incentives for conversion to Christianity. And Christianity became an attractive option. So we then have what we call Christendom. It's no longer just Christianity, but a Christendom, a dominion of Christians, a kingdom of Christians, if you want. So that's why you use the word Christendom to describe this thing that now had happened, where Christianity became a state religion, and how people became Christians and were initiated into the church changed, as most of the population professed to be Christians. And the focus for the recruitment of the church was on baptizing infants, whom preachers would later remind of the promises made in their behalf by parents and sponsors. So there's a whole shift that happened in the Roman Empire. So conquest and Christianity became linked from the time of Constantine. So Constantine, remember, by this sign conquer. This is the first time that we now have conquest being associated with Christianity. Up to this time, Christianity was a pacifist religion, pacifist faith. And when it entered Western Europe, this is something that then happened even now, later on, when Christianity entered Western Europe much later. It entered much later than it did the southern and eastern parts of the world. And when it entered Western Europe, it entered by conquest. So, for example, there's a man called Charlemagne. He was a Frank king who conquered the Saxons in 804, following a 30-year war. Remember, did you hear that? 804 is when the Saxons were conquered by Charlemagne. And conquest often resulted in conquered areas being forced to become Christians. Or maybe it's better to say being advised that they were now Christians because they were under a Christian king. So you wake up in the morning and you are advised that you are now a Christian because yesterday you were conquered by a certain king who is a Christian. So Christianity was by conquest. Now, I want you to understand something else, that the people that we are talking about, the Western European people, came from Germanic tribes. They were the Germanic people. So Germans does not denote a race as such, but a linguistic and cultural group. So there's a distinction made between North Germans. The Northern Germans became the Swedes, the Danes, the Norwegians, Icelanders, basically the Scandinavians are the Northern Germans. The Eastern Germans were the Vandals, the Goths, the Burgundians, and Langobards. And then the Western Germans were the Franks, Alemans, and Saxons. Okay? Now, you will know, of course, that the English are the Anglo-Saxons. They came in from the Germanic tribes. And it's very interesting when you realize that the Saxons were actually conquered in 804. And let me talk a little bit more about this. So Charlemagne identified his empire with the Imperium Christianum, which is the empire of Christ, or the city of God. And that meant that being a Frank and being a Christian amounted to the same thing. Thus, trust and loyalty in God and in the king were on the same wavelengths. So consequently, Saxons were seen as those who were fighting against the Christians. And it was obvious that after conquest, everyone had to be baptized because a Christian ruler did not want to rule over pagan subjects. So this is the situation that then happened. And this is how Europe became Christian, if you want. They were not converted in the sense of making a decision, a conscious decision to follow Christ. But they woke up in the morning and they were told that you are now Christians because you have been conquered. And then how do you make these people you have just conquered understand that they are now Christians? Then the tradition of cultural infiltration rather than overthrow persisted. So remember, we talked about cultural infiltration in the first session as the way in which the church approached this. Rather than to say these are demons and overthrow them, they infiltrated the culture by incorporating the practices. So the Christianity which entered the Germanic people groups incorporated indigenous religious practices into the faith. And this is how we then get some of the practices that we have today. So for example, Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus has many ancient features of Woden worship. Variant names of Woden, there's Woden, Odin. So Woden came in on 6 December. That is the day that the Christian calendar begins the holy month. So 6 December was the day in which Woden would come in with gifts and presents to the community in terms of the way that they understood it. What they did was they made that Saint Nicholas Day instead of the day Woden would come in and give gifts. So that was the 6th of December. And if you know, even in some of the church traditions, 6 December begins to be the Advent period, when the Advent period begins. Because that was the period in which the solstice festivals or the Yule festival actually began. And they changed it to Saint Nicholas because there was a bishop who was known for his generosity, particularly giving to children, who was called Nicholas. And in commemoration of that bishop, they named, they changed this to Saint Nicholas Day, the 6th of December. About Martin Luther, actually, if you read and you understand this, Martin Luther in the Reformation, he influenced the church to move the gift-giving day to Christmas Eve rather than St. Nicholas Day, 6 December, so that Woden's gift-giving day would not be remembered as the 6th of December, but it would be remembered more, it would be connected more to the birth of Christ on 25 December. So Christmas Eve became the gift-giving day because of some of these ways in which they were trying to manage the culture. Odin was worshipped by the upper classes, Thor by the peasant population, and it's claimed in the time of the Vikings, Christianity was little more than old paganism in a new form with only the names of Christ and Thor exchanged. The main new development was that Christians did not eat horse meat or offer human sacrifices, but it was much the same as Woden and Thor worship. So the Yule festival was an ancient Germanic winter festival celebrated around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year and longest night, marking the rebirth of the sun. And the Yule feast began on 25 December, after the day of the year lasted 12 nights. After that, 12 nights, and it was a time of universal peace. You may have heard songs, the 12th day of Christmas, da-da-da-da-da-da. They're basically trying to incorporate all these things into there. And they even talk about, the visit of the Magi in early January. So it's in early January after 25 December. So there's a celebration of the visit of the Magi 12 days later. So those are some of the things that got incorporated into the churches. But during this midwinter festival, there were processions, singing, dancing, and drinking. That's what the Yule feast was about. And all kinds of customs at the Yule feast were connected with the figure of Odin and have slipped into the celebration of Christmas. They cannot be explained from Christianity. I'm just giving it to you as it is so that you understand some of that background. Whenever Christianity enters a culture, this is the challenge that we have now in contextualization or syncretism. Syncretism is mixing two faiths and coming up with something different. Contextualization is you're trying to get into the context and be relevant. So the challenge, whenever Christianity enters a culture, the challenge is to be relevant to that context. And in trying to be relevant, it can go too far and become indistinguishable from the culture. The Christian message can now become distorted to the extent of no longer being Christian. And the traditions of evergreen decorations like trees and wreaths, gift giving, Santa Claus, and so on, have influenced modern Christmas celebrations, and they're still practiced by modern pagans and even Wiccan, which is witchcraft in the northern hemisphere. And there are other celebrations like Halloween and Easter, which have some of these similar pagan elements that have been Christianized. Now the question comes, what do we do? Should we completely stop these practices? And I'm asking the question, can we completely stop these practices? So the level of penetration of these pagan elements into our modern societies goes beyond Christmas to the naming of months in the calendar and even days of the week. So names of gods have survived in English in the days of the week. Sunday and Monday recall the old worship of the sun and moon. Tyre survives in Tuesday, Woden in Wednesday, Thor in Thursday, Frasier in Friday. And before even the English naming of these, we had something that predated that, which was the Roman naming of Saturday, which is after the god Satan. Now, shall we change the days of the week as well? Because if we are going to try to change all this, can we also go down right? If you want to be consistent, then maybe you shouldn't call the day that you've just called today, whatever day, if it's Monday, you can't call it Monday anymore. You need to find another name. So we've got a challenge. How deeply this has penetrated our culture is something that maybe we cannot go away from. And in the next session, we want to now discuss how then should we celebrate Christmas? In light of all these facts that I've given you, how then should we celebrate Christmas? You're blessed and continue in God's favor. We look forward to the next session with you. How then should we celebrate Christmas?